In the early 19th century, Madagascar was an island of vast forests, exotic wildlife and deeply rooted traditions. Yet beneath its beauty lay rivalries and struggles for power that would eventually give rise to one of the most feared monarchs in African history. Ranavalona, a young woman of noble blood but modest beginnings, rose through intrigue and fate. When King Radama I died without an heir, she seized the throne in 1828, claiming her right as his widow despite objections from rivals. Her coronation was not just a transfer of power. It was the beginning of a reign of terror. She believed the throne was her divine right, and she intended to defend it with fire and blood. At first, nobles and commoners alike whispered that she would be a weak ruler. They underestimated her resolve, for Ranavalona quickly proved she was no passive queen. She became a storm sweeping across Madagascar's political landscape. Foreigners had begun to creep into the island during Radama's reign, missionaries, traders and envoys bringing European ideas. Ranavalona saw them as a threat to her authority, fearing they would dilute Malagasy traditions and undermine her absolute rule. She announced to her court that foreign influence was poison. Christianity, she declared, was a disease brought by outsiders, and Western customs were chains waiting to enslave her people. Her first act of cruelty was swift and shocking. Dozens of her late husband's allies were executed in public, accused of treason without trial. Their blood was meant to send a message. Loyalty was owed only to her. Ranavalona established spies across the kingdom. Servants, neighbors, even relatives reported whispers of dissent. No one was safe from suspicion, and silence became a survival tool. The queen revived an ancient practice called the tangina ordeal. Accused individuals were forced to eat 3 pieces of chicken skin with poison from the tangina nut. If they vomited them intact, they were innocent. If not, death awaited. Tens of thousands were subjected to this ordeal in the first years of her reign. Entire villages trembled when royal messengers arrived with accusations, for survival rested on the stomach's ability to fight poison. Ranavalona saw the ordeal as divine justice, but for the people it was hell. Families were ripped apart and corpses lined the roads leading to the capital, Antananarivo. Christian converts suffered especially under her watch. Missionaries had brought schools, literacy, and the Bible, but the queen despised these changes. She ordered converts to renounce their faith or face torture. Some were flogged until their backs were raw with blood. Others were shackled and left in pits without food. Many were executed by being hurled from cliffs, their screams echoing across the valleys. Despite her cruelty, Ranavalona was cunning. She used forced labor to strengthen her kingdom, building massive palaces and fortresses. Thousands of workers were driven like slaves, whipped if they faltered, starved if they resisted. The roads of Madagascar became rivers of sweat and blood. Men carried stones until their bones snapped, women collapsed from exhaustion, and children were taken to replace fallen workers. Foreigners who tried to intervene met her wrath as well. Traders seeking to profit from Madagascar's resources often found themselves imprisoned, tortured, or expelled. Yet, Ranavalona was not careless. She understood the value of limited trade and diplomacy, balancing brutality with cunning deals. To her, cruelty was simply another tool of governance. Her reign turned into a reign of fear. Villagers prayed not to be summoned for labor or trials. They whispered her name only in private, for even shadows seemed to carry her ears. The queen's palace became a symbol of dread. Its towering walls were decorated with the labor of broken backs, and within, her court was filled with suspicion and treachery. Even nobles lived in fear. Those who displeased her faced torture by fire, water, or blade. Some were tied to stakes and left for the sun to roast, their flesh blistering under the open sky. But Ranavalona's cruelty was not without purpose. She believed herself chosen by the ancestors to protect Madagascar from foreign domination. Every drop of blood spilled was, in her mind, a shield for her nation. This twisted justification made her tyranny absolute. The more she killed, the stronger she believed her kingdom became. She saw herself not as a monster, but as a guardian queen. Meanwhile, the people of Madagascar wept under her rule. Families lost fathers to forced labor. mothers to poison ordeals, and children to the Queen's endless demands. Foreign missionaries recorded the horrors in secret journals, smuggling tales of her cruelty to Europe. They wrote of an island drenched in fear, ruled by a queen who cared little for mercy. One account described prisoners tied together with ropes, marched for days without food, only to be executed upon arrival. Another told of villages burned for sheltering Christians. Still, Ranavalona thrived on these tales. She relished the image of being feared beyond her island, for fear was her strongest weapon. Her court performed rituals to sanctify her reign. Sacrifices of zebu cattle were made, and ancestral spirits were invoked to justify her bloody rule. To oppose her was to oppose the ancestors themselves. By the mid-1830s, Ranavalona had solidified her grip on power. She had silenced dissent, crushed rivals, and forced her people into submission. Yet the seeds of hatred and despair were growing. Her people lived in terror, but whispers of resistance began to form in hidden places. Secret prayers, forbidden meetings, and desperate hopes flickered in the shadows. The Queen, however, remained vigilant. Her spies tightened their grip, and her punishments grew even harsher. She would not allow even a spark of rebellion to ignite. Madagascar, once known for its beauty, became an island of fear. Travelers spoke of it as a land where death waited around every corner, and where a queen's wrath was swifter than justice. Ranavalona's grip on Madagascar tightened with each passing year. By the 1830s and 1840s, her rule had become a storm of blood, fear, and forced obedience. The Queen viewed her people not as subjects to be protected, but as tools to be used. Every man, woman, and child was expected to serve her vision of an isolated, self-reliant kingdom. She unleashed brutal campaigns of forced labor known as fanampoana. Citizens were ordered to build fortresses, dig moats, and construct roads that stretched across treacherous mountains. Tens of thousands were driven from their villages, given little food, and forced to march for miles. Men carried massive stones, women bore supplies, and children worked as water carriers. Exhaustion was met with the crack of whips. The weak were left to die on the roadside, their bodies becoming grim markers along the Queen's projects. One of her grandest undertakings was the construction of the Rova of Antananarivo, her sprawling palace complex. It rose from the hills as a monument to her power and the suffering of her people. Workers collapsed by the hundreds under the weight of timber and stone. The survivors built walls that gleamed white against the sun, a cruel reminder of labor done with bloodied hands. Ranavalona demanded tribute not only in labor, but in lives. She kept her soldiers loyal through terror, sending them on brutal expeditions to crush dissent in distant provinces. Entire communities suspected of disloyalty were wiped out. Villages burned, fields destroyed, and survivors were dragged in chains to the capital for punishment. The Queen's paranoia grew with each year. She believed that enemies lurked everywhere, waiting to topple her throne. Her solution was always the same: ruthless elimination. Suspected conspirators were tortured in inventive ways. Some were bound in chains and left to starve, others pierced with spears or burned alive before crowds meant to learn obedience. The infamous Tangina ordeal continued to claim thousands of lives. It became not just a trial but a weapon of fear, ensuring that no one dared question her decrees. By some accounts, nearly 1/3 of the population of Madagascar perished during her reign. Death was not an accident of nature, but a direct product of her will. Christians remained among her most hated enemies. Converts who clung to their new faith were hunted, imprisoned, or forced into deadly ordeals. Public executions became spectacles. Believers were tied together and hurled from rocky cliffs, their cries echoing into the valleys below. Others were speared while refusing to renounce their God. Missionaries had fled by now, but their teachings had taken root among secret followers. For Ranavalona, these hidden worshippers were proof of treachery that demanded constant persecution. The Queen also mistrusted foreign traders. She allowed some to remain for the sake of weapons and resources, but punished others with imprisonment or torture when deals soured. One French trader was said to have been boiled alive for cheating her court. Another was tied to a stake, left to the sun and devoured by insects. Despite her cruelty, Ranavalona was cunning enough to maintain fragile control. She balanced terror with diplomacy, occasionally opening trade to keep her army supplied. But even her army was a tool of torment. Soldiers conscripted from villages marched long distances, poorly fed and burdened with impossible tasks. Desertion meant death, often by impalement. The Queen also ordered mass hunts for criminals and rebels. Captured men were forced into gladiatorial contests, fighting each other or wild beasts for her entertainment. Spectators watched as prisoners were mauled by dogs or speared by fellow captives. The Queen sat above them, expressionless, as if their screams were nothing more than music to her ears. Her obsession with control extended into daily life. She imposed strict laws on marriage, property, and worship. Any violation was treated as betrayal, and betrayal was punished with blood. Even nobles could not escape her wrath. Trusted advisers were executed suddenly if she suspected disloyalty. Her court lived in constant terror, bowing with trembling knees. The Queen's cruelty left Madagascar isolated. Europeans who once sought alliances now feared her, branding her a savage monarch beyond reason. Travelers who dared to land on her shores returned with tales of horror, forced labor camps, endless executions, and a queen who ruled with iron and fire. For the Malagasy people, life became a test of endurance. Survival meant silence, obedience, and submission to endless labor. Villages prayed not for prosperity but for invisibility, hoping to avoid the attention of her officials. A summons from the palace was often a death sentence. The land itself bore the scars of her rule. Roads carved through forests, fortresses squatting on hills, and palaces gleaming with cruel beauty all testified to the suffering of the masses. And yet, through this reign of terror, Ranavalona remained untouchable. She saw herself as chosen by the ancestors, and her survival proved in her mind that she was divinely protected. As decades passed, her legend grew darker. She was no longer seen as just a queen. She was a figure of dread, a living symbol of suffering. Whispers among the people painted her as both human and demon. To some, she was the guardian of tradition. To most, she was the hand of death. In the shadows, however, hope still lingered. Secret Christians prayed in hidden places. Dissenters plotted in whispers. Foreign powers watched, waiting for her reign to falter. But for now, Ranavalona reigned unchallenged, her iron grip choking the island. Every heartbeat in Madagascar echoed with fear of the African queen of pain and death. By the 1850s, Ranavalona had ruled Madagascar for more than 2 decades. Her reign, forged in terror, had already scarred generations. But the queen showed no signs of softening with age. Though older and more fragile in body, her will remained steel. She clung to power with the same cruelty and suspicion that had defined her early years. Her enemies, both real and imagined, were still hunted with merciless precision. Dissenters were dragged from their homes, Christians were rooted out, and rivals within her own court were executed. Yet the world outside Madagascar was changing rapidly. European powers grew stronger, advancing with modern armies, while Ranavalona kept her nation isolated in fear and blood. France and Britain, once willing to cooperate with Madagascar, had now turned cold. Traders avoided her ports, missionaries stayed away, and diplomats carried tales of horror back to their homelands. Despite her hostility, she still craved the weapons and luxuries that foreigners could provide. Carefully, she permitted a trickle of trade, but always under her harsh rules. Merchants who defied her terms were punished brutally. One account tells of sailors left to starve in cages, their cries echoing across the harbor as a warning to others. Her own people remained trapped in forced labor. Men and women were still driven to expand palaces, roads, and fortresses, monuments to her paranoia. The construction of fortified walls around Antananarivo consumed countless lives. Workers collapsed from hunger, disease, and exhaustion, but the queen demanded progress at any cost. For Ranavalona, suffering was not failure. It was proof of loyalty. Those who endured showed devotion to the crown. Those who perished had proven themselves unworthy. But the toll was enormous. Madagascar's population continued to dwindle, villages emptied, and farmland lay abandoned as families were ripped apart by labor demands. Famine struck as a result. With so many hands forced into state projects, crops withered in the fields, leaving thousands to starve. Yet the queen seemed unmoved by the suffering. In her mind, hardship was the price of purity, and purity was the shield against foreign corruption. Her cruelty reached into the most intimate corners of life. Converts who secretly clung to Christianity were executed in public displays meant to terrorize the masses. Some were burned alive, others pierced by spears, and many were thrown from cliffs in waves of blood-soaked persecution. Their only crime was praying to a god she despised. Ranavalona's paranoia extended even to her own son, Prince Rakoto. Though he was heir to the throne, she mistrusted him deeply, suspecting he sympathized with foreign ideas. Rakoto, in secret, despised his mother's cruelty. He maintained contacts with French officials, dreaming of a future where Madagascar would be open to the world again. But for now, he was powerless. To challenge his mother was to invite death, and Ranavalona was known to execute her own family without hesitation. Still, rumors grew of Rakoto's quiet alliances. The Queen's court whispered of plots, though few dared to speak openly, for her spies were everywhere. In the capital, Antananarivo, life had become unbearable. The streets were lined with beggars, the markets thin, and the people bowed with fear instead of loyalty. The Queen's palace, built with the blood of her people, loomed over them all. Its high walls were both fortress and prison, holding Madagascar captive. Foreign observers who managed to slip into the island described a kingdom drenched in misery. They wrote of endless executions, hollow-eyed workers, and a queen who smiled only at cruelty. Even among her soldiers, loyalty wavered. Many obeyed out of fear, but their hearts longed for change. Desertions grew, though most deserters met brutal ends. Ranavalona's isolation also weakened her militarily. Without steady foreign alliances, her forces lacked modern weapons, making them vulnerable in an age of European conquest. Still, no foreign army dared invade while she lived. Her cruelty was matched by cunning, and she wielded Madagascar's terrain and warriors with ruthless skill. As the years dragged on, her body grew frail, but her spirit remained cruel. Advisors reported that she still demanded executions well into her 60s. Her enemies were speared, burned, or poisoned. Tangina ordeals continued, and prisons overflowed with the condemned. But beneath the surface, her rule was cracking. The people whispered louder now, though still in secret. They prayed for her death, hoping for freedom when her reign finally ended. In 1861, after 33 years of tyranny, the Queen's body could no longer carry her iron will. She fell ill, her strength fading at last. Her death was not accompanied by remorse or repentance. She left the world as she had ruled, unyielding, convinced of her righteousness. The palace that had echoed with screams now fell silent as courtiers prepared for her passing. Outside its walls, the people dared to hope for the first time in decades. When word spread that Ranavalona was dead, Madagascar trembled not with grief, but with relief. Her reign of blood had ended. Prince Rakoto, now King Radama II, ascended the throne with a vision opposite of his mother's. He opened Madagascar to the world, welcomed foreigners, and sought reform. But Ranavalona's shadow lingered. The scars of her rule could not be erased overnight. The population had been halved, villages destroyed, and faith in leadership shattered. Her legacy was carved not in monuments but in suffering. Roads, palaces, and fortresses stood as mute witnesses to the countless lives they had consumed. To some she remained a defender of tradition, a queen who resisted foreign domination. To most, she was remembered as a tyrant whose cruelty darkened Madagascar's history. The world came to know her name with dread, Queen Ranavalona the Frarms, the African queen of pain and death. And though the queen was gone, her legend lived on in whispers, a haunting reminder of what happens when power feeds on blood.